So one listener with the Instagram handle Firmenstein, great name, they're a Green Party member. They asked, how do you maintain the coalition of voters, lots of whom don't see us as a left-wing party, whilst being louder about our socialist policies? Can we maintain the nice, sensible reputation while making a lot more noise? Ellie, I'll start with you.
The point that Firmenstein is making about being able to reach out and speak to and appeal to a really wide range of people is something I completely agree with, and it's something I've totally experienced in my own campaigning. And so I know that we've got to be able to speak to a lot of different people. We've got to be able to connect with where they are. And our green identity is really core to that. You know, our focus on building a better future for our kids and the next generation is something that people really understand viscerally about us. Tackling inequality is also at the centre of our politics and our policies. And that's, you know, it's completely integrated. We need to be able to, sorry.
I want to challenge you just a little bit here, but like Firmenstein's assertion, which I have to say I have seen and heard and maybe even agree, is that there is a perception that the Green Party is not left-wing. Is the Green Party left-wing?
Absolutely.
And would be shouting about that, being proud of that, be something that we would see?
I am really proud that we're a left-wing party. I think if you look at what I talk about in Parliament, in my constituency, if you look at what the Green Party does as a whole, we're clearly a left-wing party. And we are able to appeal to people who previously have been really put off by Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn or whatever. And that's a real strength that we've got as the Green Party, because people know that we are really, really rooted in our values. People vote for us, even if they don't agree with absolutely everything that's in our manifesto. And of course, that's normal in politics, right? You've never find anybody that you agree with completely 100%, but people see in us something that they trust. And trust is a really missing thing in politics as a whole. At the minute, we see, Farage's kind of votes go up and down. And frankly, they've gone up and down hugely over the last 10 years, depending on what else is going on. We have consistently grown and grown and grown because we've built that trust. And so I think we do need to be better at cutting through nationally. We've definitely upped our game in the last year. It's absolutely helped having 4 MPs, but we've also got to recognise that our superpower, if you like, is the trust that we've got among a wide range of voters. And that is rooted in their recognition that we stand for a greener and a fairer country, and that they want to support people that they can believe in.
Zack, let me bring you in. That notion, lots of people don't see the Green Party as a left-wing party. Do you agree with that?
I think lots of people don't see it as a left-wing party, which is why we need to talk about socialism more often. And we need to talk about the fact that we want to redistribute wealth from the very wealthy to help fund our public services and reduce inequality. Now, I've been having lots of chats with Gary Stevenson, so if some of this sounds familiar, that's partly why. Inequality is at the heart of everything, and that's whether you live in a town, a city, or the countryside. Now, look, I live in Hackney. I'm a London Assembly member. I'm not going to lie, I'm much more comfortable in the city than I am putting a pair of wellies on. However, during the election, a Guardian journalist came round with me for a few hours, and they wrote an article about how surprised they were that I was able to connect with dairy farmers. And that's because if you live in a city, you're being screwed by unscrupulous landlords, or you could be being screwed by unscrupulous landlords. You need rent controls. But if you're a farmer, you're being screwed over by supermarkets, or you might even be a tenant farmer, which means you're having to pay too much to your landlord. It's the same system that's screwing people over. So we do need to tackle inequality. And I think that's why wherever you live, our Green Party message is universal, which again is about tackling elites and making sure we're lifting everyone up.
But on Firmenstein's questions, can you maintain the nice, sensible reputation whilst being proudly socialist?
Well, I reject some of the nice, sensible reputation thing, to be honest. I think we should be kind. I'm always there to be kind. I think nice is a word that just makes me go, meh. I think that's part of the problem with the party, is maybe we've just been too nice. I'm not suggesting we're nasty for a second, but I am suggesting we pick fights. Just 2 nights ago, I was on the radio with Andrea Jenkins. She's the Reform Mayor of Lincolnshire. We had a proper Barney on the radio, and I think people loved it. Ultimately, though, the things she was saying were dangerous. She was basically climate denying. We're really at that point now with Reform. And I really called her out on that. The fact that Reform have taken £2.3 million in donations from fossil fuel companies. George Carlin had that old quote that politicians like NASCAR drivers should have to wear who sponsors them on their shirts. And I think with Reform, every time we're on TV and radio with them, and I say, you need to know who's paying them to say these things.
The Green Party's historically stood up for trans rights and women's rights, but The Guardian's reported recently that the party was split over its response to the recent Supreme Court ruling that biological sex defines legal gender. Now, responding to this, one of our listeners, Cameron, asked, how would you deal with the gender critics in the party, some of whom have taken us to court, costing us thousands?
It's really sad that conflict over sex and gender has resulted in court cases, and clearly we need to look at some of our internal processes, disciplinary processes
The Green
as
Party
well.
had to pay £90,000 to Shara Ali over a case of what he described as his gender critical views being.
So we need to make sure that the party is not making decisions that leave us open to legal challenge and to having to pay those costs. The party's got a hugely proud record of standing up for trans rights, of affirming the reality and the validity of trans identities, and of campaigning for true inclusion. And I'm really proud of that. I really support that. We have to recognise the Supreme Court ruling, and the party again has been really clear that, we, at the same time as recognising that, there are implications, and I've, immediately had trans constituents coming to see me in my constituency surgery saying, look, I've lived as a trans woman for years, and now I'm supposedly not able to use the toilets I've always gone into. The EHRC's interim guidance straight afterwards was, I think, actively unhelpful. I think we do need to be able to talk about these sensitive and sometimes contentious issues. We need to make sure also that we're a party where we can have open and honest and compassionate conversations about these issues too, recognising that what are sometimes called gender critical views are protected by law. We need to be able to have those conversations. And so, my whole politics is about trying to find areas of common ground. We do need to pick fights. Well, pick fights is not language that I would personally choose, actually. We need to be really, really strong in opposing things that are wrong. But at the same time, we also need to be able to have conversations about complex and contentious issues. And we need to be able to at least sit down with people that we disagree with to understand why they're at the position they're at, and whether we can find any way of finding that common ground.
Zack, how would you deal with the gender critics in the party?
Yeah, just to come off the back of that, I'll always pick fights. I'll pick fights with people who are demonising disabled people, who are demonising migrants, who are committing genocide. I think it's important that we do pick fights. I'm not talking about just doing it or courting controversy for the sake of it, but being in the ring rather than the sidelines and going, actually, to be kind and to be compassionate, you can fight and you can do that. I'm obviously not talking about violent fighting. I'm not talking about physically. So that's just a choice of words. On the trans rights are human rights, and that's unconditional for me. Yes, we can have kind and we should have compassionate conversations. Ultimately, though, there is a line for me, and the line is to recognise that the Supreme Court ruling was a mess. Now, of course, we need to respect it because it's the Supreme Court, but to have Keir Starmer saying that's what the Supreme Court says, so that's my understanding, is a complete nonsense. Ultimately, the Supreme Court are there to interpret the law, but as legislators, it's our job to create the law that the Supreme Court then rules on. So to have the Labour Party kind of so absent on this conversation, and to have Wes Streeting really pushing the division on this in so many ways, and also the fact he's taken so much money from private healthcare, I think creates lots of questions. Now, when we talk about the Green Party, we often talk about being a broad church. I agree with that. But broad churches have walls. And if your MO is to misgender someone, anyone can do that accidentally. I've certainly done it accidentally. But if you are doing that repeatedly, that is harassment. And my bold leadership requires me to also tell the truth. And harassment is not welcome in the Green Party. Transphobia is not welcome in the Green Party. So people can think what they want. I'm not there to tone or thought police people, but I am there to create a safe space, particularly for the most vulnerable people or the most marginalised people. And that's always my politics. I always think in this room, is the most marginalised or vulnerable person represented in this room? Because actually that lifts everyone up. If we're always making sure we're designing a society that is the most inclusive and most welcome for a disabled person, a migrant, a trans person, whoever it might be, then ultimately that's a more equal society for everyone. So yes to kind and compassionate conversations, but also yes to being very clear about our values and not needing to be a home to everyone. Other parties are available.
Go for it,
I
Ellie.
just wanted to pick up on this this conversation about picking fights, which I think is perhaps one of the contrasts between our approaches. Because for me, The language of picking fights is a very polarizing language, and that's the sort of thing that really puts people off. I hear it all the time on the doorstep in politics. And it's absolutely possible to be totally clear about what you stand for, to challenge power constantly. For example, I've spoken out on Gaza basically every week since I've been elected. I've been a very, very strong voice in Parliament, constantly holding the government to account. Recently, for example, leading a debate, challenging them on their responsibilities under the Genocide Convention to act to prevent genocide. I don't conceive of that as picking a fight. I think of it as being really powerful in opposition and in standing up for what you believe in. And my whole experience in politics is that the polarization is what really turns people off. And we need to have a politics that's about inclusion. We need to create a politics that's about helping people to feel hopeful that there are people that they can connect with, helping people to feel that they understand what we're talking about, rather than being pushed away by the framing.
So I think this is a privileged position. I think ultimately the people in this country who are really suffering right now need people to fight for us. They need people to fight with them, and they need to know that the Green Party are on their side. Yes to challenging power, but that's picking a fight. That's exactly what I'm talking about. I think the people in this country need us to connect with anger. If we stay in anger, we're just turning into reform. I'm not suggesting that for a second. What we need to do, though, is if we just go straight to hope, that sounds out of touch. And it results in exactly where I started this conversation from. People say, oh, I like the Green Party, but they don't really seem to understand me. You need to connect with the anger, because that's where people are at right now in this country, and then turn it to hope, turn it to solutions. But if you don't connect with the anger, first of all, then you miss people entirely. There's a lot to be angry about right now. And if you're not angry, then people aren't paying attention.